Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, after all the frivolity going on to the left and right of me. Right, good evening, members, and welcome to the Policy and Resources Committee meeting of the 23rd of October. In the event of a fire alarm, Mr O'Connell will assess the situation and provide further instruction on the evacuation of the building if necessary. I would remind you that this meeting is being broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Maidstone Borough Council website, but if anyone else will be recording or filming proceedings, I ask them to let me know now. Councillor Mackay may do. I ask this not so that people shouldn't do any filming or recording, it's just so that we know it may be happening. Members who are using mobile phones or tablets are asked, please, to ensure that they are on silent and that you are only using them with regard to the business on the agenda this evening. Right, apologies for absence. Committee Clerk, please.
I've received apologies for absence from Councillor Round.
Notification of substitute members then, please.
Councillor David Burton for Councillor Round.
And Councillor Patrick Orton for Councillor Val-Springett.
Okay, thank you very much. Urgent items then, item 3. There is an additional nomination form received for the item on outside bodies, and I agree to take that. There is also a question from Councillor Tom Sams that I've agreed to take after the question from the member of the public. We will take that item at item 10. Item 4, notification of any visiting members. I have nobody notifying me that they're a visiting member, Councillor Sams. Oh, right. If you could just bear with me a second, the committee clerk will be speaking to Mr. Councillor / Sams.
It'll be visiting for item 10.
So, item 4, notification of visiting members, please. I see Councillor Sams raising his hand. You'll be speaking at item 10, yes? Thank you very much. Item 5, disclosures by members and officers. Thank you. Nobody's indicated. Any disclosures of lobbying from item 6? Councillor Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. I've been lobbied on the nomination to outside bodies, item 14.
Thank you very much. We'll note that to the appropriate point. Nobody else? Thank you. Okay, item 7, to consider whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. There are part 2 papers regarding Granada House. Is that agreed to take those in private? Agree. Right, hold on. So you're not agreeing, you're wanting points. It was Councillor Burton first and then Councillor Pearl.
Very simply, Chairman, I find myself sitting at very, very late notice. I have no sight of those papers. I won't go over that issue again with you, but they're not available electronically. May I have a copy? Because I don't even know what I'm participating in.
Okay, I'll give you an adjournment before the item's heard, so we'll get through the first part of business and then we'll do that if that's okay. Councillor Pearl, then I'll come to you, Councillor Blackmore.
I'll keep it brief, Chairman. Just my standard objection to the fact that we will, in effect, be talking about elements of building and development behind closed doors by taking this in part 2.
Noted, thank you. Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you, Chairman. I received my papers for this committee last week, but there were no yellow pages attached. So I haven't seen them either, which is rather disappointing.
Okay, in which case I will take the adjournment, so A, you can read them, Councillor Burton, and Councillor Blackmore will give you the same opportunity. Okay, thank you very much. Item 8, minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of September 2019. Are these agreed as a correct record? Thank you. I will therefore sign those. Item 9, presentation of any petitions. We don't have any. So item 10, questions and answer session for the public. There is a question from Miss Joanna Burns. Would you please step forward and press the central button to speak? Thank you. If you could just all wait where you are, please. The doors closed automatically because of the fire alarm, therefore we will wait here because it's a fire door and I will be the last one out of the room, which I will then close. If you go outside into Jubilee Square, away from the building, if we're asked to vacate the building. Okay, if you could take your seats as quickly as possible, please. We are still webcasting because we didn't obviously stop it. But apparently it was 3.5 minutes for the evacuation. So if you'll just stay where you are, we've got to get out under 2, so we'll go again. No, I'm joking. But for any of you watching on the webcast, we had a trial fire alarm, but we are now all back in the building, and I'll just wait for people to take their seats. And yes, absolutely. And then we'll ask Miss Joanna Burns to start from the top. Hold on, one. Just. You can take your jacket off unless you're. That's fine. You looked a bit wrapped up, and I didn't want to. I am. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
It's been 6 months since Maidstone Borough Council declared a climate emergency. What progress has been made with regard to this, such as introducing the city tree and/or planting more trees, not building houses or roads on green spaces, building an extensive integrated cycle path system, solar panels on new builds, and to this end, when will these policies be implemented?
Firstly, Ms Burns, thank you very much for the question. Following the declaration, we recognise the enormity of the task in hand and that this will require more than just a quick fix solution. As a result, we've set up a biodiversity and climate change councillor working group to create an action plan for the borough to be carbon neutral by 2030. This action plan will be submitted for approval through this committee in April of 2020. The group are meeting with experts and stakeholders and undertaking research to identify the best actions for the borough. They'll be identifying policies and actions across all of our services, not just one-off initiatives. The council has a priority for the borough to be safe, clean and green, and has been taking action across a number of areas tackling climate change, improving air quality and increasing biodiversity. These include such projects and the things we're looking at, such as our Clean Air for Schools project, which is aimed at primary schools across Maidstone, designed to engage with students and via them, their parents, to raise awareness of air quality issues that people can do to help themselves and improve the air quality locally. Following Arriva's successful trial of an electric bus on the 82 route, we are now working on a bid to DEFRA for funding for an electric bus or electric buses. Our Union Street car park has had an electric vehicle charging unit installed in July, providing 2 charging bays, with a further 18 bays to be added across the borough. Our Go Green, Go Wild project has been created to encourage people to look after nature on their own doorstep. We have just won a year of, this is a bit of a tongue twister, a year of Green Action Bees Needs Award for the 7 stunning wildflower meadows that are being created across Maidstone with the help of volunteers. The gogreengowild.com site has also just gone live, and we are encouraging local people to create wildlife corridors, to encourage native species and to provide habitats so that wildlife can thrive throughout Maidstone. We've also approached KCC to introduce a red route in Upper Stone Street to change it from the no stopping zone to again reduce air pollution. We're joining a water refill scheme to get businesses in the borough to sign up to filling water bottles for free and are looking to fund these 3 watering fountains for people in our town centre with that, so that we cut out the reusable non-reusable plastic bottles. Trialling electric vehicles at our depot, we're also recycling rainwater and have in place the solar panels on the whole of the depot. We're improving the Ashford Road and carrying out works from Willington Street to King Street including additional planting, encouraging the use of a cycle route, and creating a wildflower meadow there. We're also planting orchard trees and an insect habitat feature. This is just a sample of some of the things that I've managed to locate that we're doing around the borough to acknowledge our safe, clean and green priority. I'm looking forward to the action plan coming to us from the working group in April so that we can push even harder to this very important agenda. I've made that as inclusive of everything we're doing because I didn't really want there to be something we've missed that we are looking at. So I hope that can reassure you. However, if there is a follow-up question, then I'm happy to take that as well.
I haven't specified a follow-up question.
The actual report that will bring the items that group has brought forward to us will be in April, as I mentioned, at the P&R meeting. If things happen on the way there, I will ask for a report to come from, I believe it's Councillor Harwood as the chairman, but the whole group itself can bring things to council or to whichever committee that it may appertain to. So if that's your supplementary question, I hope that's a suitable answer. I will also now pass this open to other nominated people from the parties or their leaders if they wish to answer the question or to ask a question of the person who's asked the question. Councillor Mackay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming tonight. A subject quite close to my heart. It was originally a Labour motion put before Council to declare a climate change emergency, but the whole Council embraced this unanimously, without dissent, and this is a Council emergency motion that was passed. I was a little bit sceptical at first, I must admit, as to whether this would be taken seriously. But I'm pleased to say that the way in which it's been met by officers, fellow councillors, I'm absolutely encouraged. A full-time person on a year's contract will be starting, I believe, on the 3rd of November, 4th of November. Already P&R have allocated funds for us to do a match funding application to DEFRA, and should we need more funds, we will have to make further applications to P&R. There will be a report, as the chairman said, to P&R, but the work of the working group has already started. It will advise committees on these matters. It has already advised Communities, Housing and Leisure, and that influenced the report they commissioned. A lot of the work for this working group will go under the radar. I mean, I'm grateful for the leader to detail some of the things we've achieved, because I've forgotten about them. You know, it's some of them. But some of the things you specifically mentioned, this working group, I think, will go on till 2030 at the very least. So everything can't be done today. And you've got to remember, this is a council working group, and it works at council pace, and it does things thoroughly. But thanks very much for coming along, Joe.
Thank you very much. I've had indication from Councillor Gooch, Councillor Perry and now Councillor Pearl. Does anybody else wish? And Councillor Burton, thank you. I can only take actual statements from the leaders of the groups at this point. I will just add, while I have the microphone on, this group actually met yesterday, so it isn't just that we've had one meeting and we've got things, it is meeting on a regular basis. There will be chances for the public to attend at various stages, so I would have hoped we would put that out on the website, or we can help to go to local groups if needed. So, Councillor Gooch and Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for coming this evening. I'd just like to be witness to the work that's going on. I happen to also be a parish councillor, and I happen to know that the group has emailed all the parish councils to say, come on, what are you going to do? So I know it's going to be on our next agenda, our being my parish council, but this is demonstrating that the Borough Council is trying to involve everybody in our borough. It's not something that we as borough councillors are going to do to our residents. That's not the way to do it. We want to involve as many people as we can and to get the residents' buy-in. So I hope that the things that our parish council think about may also be things that other parish councils think about, and there may be a different kind of set of ideas that comes forward. But we do feel very positive about it. The only one thing that's a pity is that we can't condense it into a very tight time scale. I'm sorry, that just can't be done. Life ain't like that. Because what we do, that is to say, not just the parishes, but certainly the Borough Council, what we're planning to do, we want it to have a lasting effect. We want it to mean something. We want it to be meaningful. And just turning on a tap somewhere isn't going to do the business. But I just wanted to put that forward as a positive sign. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Councillor Perry?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the question. I do actually think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. Well, I hope we are, at any rate. I'm going to hand over to Councillor Pearl because he was at the working group yesterday. It's very important. I just want to make just one point. I think there are things we can do actually now because we've got a local plan review coming up. Very, very important that. And we can get into that. Issues like charging points should all new estates to have charging point. Trees, very, very important. You mentioned that in your point, and I totally agree with you. And solar panels on houses and green space. These are all things we can actually do, practical things, and I think we should be pushing for this as a council. And I'm sure my colleagues, when we go through the local plan review, we'll have the same view. But I'll hand over to Councillor Pearl because I'd like to get his views on the working group, if that's possible.
Thank you. Well, I was going to just add a couple of points. The first is, as has been said, we've had a number of meetings, one of which was yesterday, and the meetings are being supported at quite a high level. So, our meeting, in terms of sort of officer support, we have the head of policy and governance, I think her title is, and likewise the Democratic Services Manager, which is obviously that chap there. Supporting. As Councillor Mackay said, that there is that there has now been a recruitment process, and a scrutiny officer has been hired, and the object is obviously so there is sort of somebody to actually do more of this, research and so forth, and put things together for us. Yesterday's meeting, I was sort of trying to address some of the points you raised directly, like city trees and planting more trees. Well, we've had quite a number of conversations about woodlands and so forth, but in terms of sort of brass tacks, one thing we discussed yesterday was making I suppose a bid is the technical term, or pricing it up, putting together basically a contingency fund out of capital, for such things as, so with city trees, I think when you asked the question originally at this committee, you talked in terms of Section 106 monies, and obviously we're trying to sort of build in some contingencies in case that the serious capital spending can't be funded that way. We've got some other method of funding it too, so that it does actually happen. And one other point there, but going back to the local plan policies and so forth, a couple of the members of the working group have then had additional meetings with the head of planning and development to discuss the brass tacks of actual planning policies, what policies can be changed for things like renewables and so on and so forth, to ensure that can get perhaps brought into the stream of the SPY committee in terms of the local plan review. So stuff is happening. A final point is we did talk about, although I don't think we ever quite nailed it down, the possibility of doing an interim report so that both councillors and the public don't necessarily have to wait till April, but I can't really make any promises on that. So.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sams, I believe you have a question as well, please.
Thank you, councillors. On Wednesday the 18th of September at the P&R Committee, in relation to the garden community proposal at Lenham, it was written in the report that there was in the region of £150,000 to be spent in this financial year. Additionally, there is a £5 million risk to this council. The £5 million was not reflected in the minutes nor the subsequent press release, nor in response to your question asked to you last week, the following week. Is the figure £5 million as stated in the report? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Councillor Sams. I think you've highlighted within the first question that we will have spent up until the end of this financial year. We estimate around £150,000 of money, which will be set aside for getting us through these initial stages. The additional £5,000 that we state here is in inverted commas at risk. Sorry, not £5,000. £5 million will be used for further consultation fees, putting it through the local plan review process, possible outline planning application, and also option payments to the landowners should it get that far. This figure is put as a risk, as it were. However, there may be opportunity that we will obtain partners in this whole process, and therefore that risk, as I say, inverted commas, would be shared with those partners. So I think it's difficult for us to actually itemise where the money will be spent as we look at this whole process. But I can assure you that certainly the £150,000 towards the end of this financial year is a figure that we are quite accurate on. But I hope that answers your initial question. Do you have a supplementary question or a follow-up?
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Would any of the leaders present like to... I'm being told that this isn't the same question as the public question, therefore it is not optional that the leaders can do that. So thank you very much, Councillor Sams. Okay, item 11 then, the committee work programme. Mr Green, if you'd like to take us through that, please.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Members will see on the committee work programme that there's a whole lot of reports on here scheduled for 20th of November, but only one report for 4th of December. So with the Chairman's agreement, I'd propose that we take 3 of those reports, asset management strategy, risk management update and debt recovery policy, to the December meeting, 4th of December meeting, to balance things out a bit, those reports not being ones that have to be dealt with in November. So that's the first point I'd like to make. And the other one is the draft budget proposals. The 1st of December is actually incorrect for that item. Those will be brought to the committee to its January meeting, 22nd of January 2020. So I hope members are content with those changes.
Okay, thank you very much. You also notice that now we have the date of that meeting, not just that it's in November and 19. So I just thought that would be a bit more helpful for us to actually see the dates as they're coming up on the worksheet as well. Does anybody have any questions of Mr Green? In which case I'll carry on then. The business rate retention projects quarterly update. Back to Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members will remember that they agreed a number of projects to be funded from the business rates retention pilot in 2 phases, and this report sets out the regular quarterly update on how we're doing with those projects. The first phase, which members agreed last year, is now about 2/3 complete. You can see the details on page 13 of your agenda. I would just point out one thing. On the very first one, Housing First and Rough Sleepers, it looks as though we've only spent £10,000. Actually, as the detail of the report makes clear, the commitment is higher, because what we've had to do where we're providing tenancies for these housing service clients is make a commitment to the landlords, which they may or may not have to take up at the end of the tenancy. So that's a bit misleading, and so actually we're pretty much up to the total commitment of 80,000 on that project. So those are the projects that were agreed last year. As I say, made good progress with most of those. And then there were some further projects that were agreed by this committee back in June, which are set out on page 15. These are still at their fairly early stages, so there's no spend shown, other than on the very first one, the improvements to the A20, the approach into Maidstone, where work is actually underway at the moment. If you've been along the A20, they've actually been busy doing work literally this week, installing a new bus stop, clearing away debris along the road. So that project is well underway already. So that's all I'll say, but I'm very happy to take any questions or pass questions on to my colleagues if you have anything on the detail that you want to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I have indication from Councillor English at the moment. Anybody else?
It's a great pity, because obviously they weren't to know, but for the members of the public who asked the question would be quite interested to actually see some of the breakdowns of the business rate retention projects. I refer particularly to Go Green, Go Wild, cycle parking infrastructure, urban trees, electric charging points, and a number of other programs that are being brought forward as part of this. So it is clear actually that the council is looking at these issues in a very joined up way, and proposals are coming forward even before the Biodiversity Action Group has brought forward its very, very important report that shows that the council, across all parties and with the support officers who've done a lot of good work to bring forward proposals, taking the opportunities where they arise to actually do concrete, if that's not completely the wrong word in this context, things to actually improve our environment. Yes, that is the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean. And it's encouraging to see that these matters going forward with a great deal of cross-party consensus and work. And now we need to just do more of the same thing. Sorry, that wasn't a question, but I think it does need saying that we see here in front of us the evidence of programs actually not just started but underway.
Yeah, I think it's good that these papers with this amount of detail is in the public view. I didn't really want to give the answer to the question with price tags attached to the various bits and pieces, because I think it's more important that we're doing what we're doing and showing the cross-party support, but also that we're planning for other things, and we may not have the prices and the whole background for those at the moment. But yeah, thank you for your non-question. Without further ado then, I'll move on to item 13. Is there an agreement on that? Okay, as you can see on page 10, the report makes following recommendations: that the committee notes the further progress of the pilot projects and also notes the early progress with the pilot projects for the following year. Is that agreed? Thank you. Councillor Burton.
Chairman, the original substitute member has actually now arrived, so with your permission, I'll excuse myself and pass over to Councillor Mrs. Bryce.
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you very much. Councillor Bryce, could you just come on the microphone for the record and say that you've taken back over your substituted position? And also, we just want to know whether you've had any, have you been lobbied on anything, and also any disclosures?
Councillor Bryce, substitute member. I haven't had any papers. I haven't seen any papers for tonight. So therefore, I don't know if I've got any disclosures or if I've been lobbied.
It would appear that the public who were here have taken our spare copies that were out there, so we'll just get you another copy and it'll come down. Okay, once you've had a scan through them then, if you'll be able to come back to us if you think you have got anything you wish to disclose. So I'll move on to item 13, property asset review. Mr. Green, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another regular quarterly update, and members will remember that back in January this year, we brought a summary of the Gen 2 report on the Council's property portfolio, and the idea of this was to make sure that we were making the most of our property assets. You asked to get regular quarterly updates on what steps we were taking, and this is the latest update. You'll see from this that the focus is on the relatively easy to deliver type projects. Gen 2 came up with a lot of recommendations, not necessarily adopted by the council. We are putting together an asset management strategy, which will be our view as to how to make the best use of our property portfolio. That's referenced on page 29. But in the meantime, you've got details here of a number of things that we're doing, and I hope you'll agree that there's quite a lot of activity happening on the property front, which is helping both to generate income for the council and also improve the quality of the council's property assets. Again, I'm very happy to take questions you may have on detail.
Okay, Councillor Bryce, I need to ask you whether you have any disclosure of pecuniary interests. Because if you do, you'd have to leave, you see.
Not with regard to this item, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I have indication from Councillor Mackay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The more estates work needed to maximise value. 2.8 on page 28 lists the Archbishop's Palace. I did raise this before, that I consider that the Carriage Museum forms part of the Archbishop's Palace. Just including a line that says we'll pay attention to the overall spatial context of the Archbishop's Palace, included the Carriage Museum, hardly includes, you've not asked the consultant to look at how else we could use the Carriage Museum, have you? You've asked him how we could reuse the Archbishop's Palace. Now, we may get a completely different answer from the consultant if we said, look at the whole, not just the one building.
Councillor Mackay, I think what we're trying to say here is that we have asked the consultants to take into account the Carriage Museum The primary focus is on the Archbishop's Palace, but if the consultant sees a use that would be complementary for the Carriage Museum, we obviously welcome his views and would take that forward. It's not, though, primarily about the Carriage Museum, it's about the Archbishop's Palace, because that's where we do need to make some decisions over the next 12 months or so, because KCC are vacating the Archbishop's Palace. They're moving the wedding registration service away from there. So that's got to be our top priority, but definitely we'll take into account not just the Carriage Museum, but also the overall context, because it's a very historical area. There's lots of historical buildings around there, and we can't look at the Archbishop's Palace in isolation.
I would concur that the Archbishop's Palace is the priority, but you include, will pay attention to the overall spatial context of the Archbishop's Palace, including the Carriage Museum and All Saints Church. Are you suggesting the consultant will also come back and give alternative uses for the church? I don't think so. What you're saying is that they are in the same area and therefore they should be respected. I mean, if we don't plan for something, we'll have the same result for the next 10 years. We'll have one of the finest buildings in Maidstone continue to be used as a storage yard for our carriages. This is such a wasted opportunity. Wasted. Most towns would be delighted to have a building the quality and beauty of the Archbishop's stables. And yet, it's squandered. It's used for half the year, and I think 6 hours a week, is it?
Well, if I may make one comment, the carriages stay there all the time, Councillor Mackay, so it's not just you. It is used to store them as a primarily. I agree that the people may only go in there for half of the year, but it is, the primary real reason is to keep them at a very static temperature and a consistent temperature. But I get where you're coming from. I'm just clarifying one thing. I have Councillor English, Councillor Perry and Councillor Bryce indicating. Councillor English first, please.
I did raise this point earlier, and actually I think the wording here is unhelpful because using the term spatial does suggest to me we're simply looking at the visual impact and the heritage impact to the eye. Now, that may not be what's meant, but that is certainly how it comes across. And actually, these three buildings do need, 4 if you count the totally underused amphitheatre, do need to be considered together to a certain point, because whilst we are not likely to consider changing the use of All Saints Church, actually there are certain fairly modest things that could be done in relation to one or other of the other buildings that would make hypothetically All Saints Church much more usable as a performance venue than it is now. That's not necessarily what we would do, but it is something really that should be taken into account when looking at this. These are 3 buildings that have connections with each other, which are not just about visibility. So I think we need, and I did raise this when we're looking at, when we had the discussion on the business rates retention and looking at the Archbishop's Palace area then, that we need to look at these 3 buildings as they potentially could function together, because regardless of the technical ownership issues, and we could be missing an opportunity to make the most of it. So I think that using the term spatial here is misleading, and it would help if it was simply removed from that word was removed from the report and we would just say the overall context.
Okay. Are you actually proposing that we remove the word spatial?
Yes, because it limits us very much.
Yeah, you said why, so you're proposing removal. Anybody seconding? Councillor Mackay. All those in favour of removing the word spatial? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those against? 1, 2, 3, 4. Abstaining? Thank you very much. Councillor Perry, next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'm back on the Carriage Museum, and let me say I agree with Councillor Mackay. And I'm sorry I'm agreeing with you again, which is worrying me, but there was a proposal, it's been around a bit now, to take the carriages and create a transport museum at Headcorn Aerodrome. And I wonder where that is, because I'm an ex-international carriage driver, so I do know this subject pretty well, and I don't like where they're stored. I think the harness is a dreadful place for harness, and it's not that much better for the carriages, actually, despite what people say. So I'm just wondering where this is, and is it still being considered? Because I think this would be a good solution. I'm not saying if the museum want to keep the old carriage, then that's fine by me. But I think as a storage, which is, I think, very well put by Councillor Mackay, it is not great, and very few people do come and see it. And I think it's completely wasted. So I'd like to know where we are with this other proposal, because this was a good proposal. I know it was early days, but I still haven't heard anything. Thank you.
Perhaps I shall ask on behalf of the committee that the relevant group that's looking at that will get back to us. I believe it might include Councillor Round and Mr Greer. So I would do that on behalf of the committee. Okay, I now have indicating Councillor Bryce and Councillor Blackmore. Councillor Bryce, please.
Thank you, Chair. My understanding of this particular project, and I know you'll correct me if I've got this wrong, Mr Green, was that the reason why we were looking at Archbishop's Palace was because KCC are moving away from that venue. And the whole reason for looking at this was to see if there is an opportunity there for us. Because if there is, then you start to widen the net and think, okay, how do we then integrate these other heritage assets that surround the Archbishop's Palace? If there isn't, then you start to look at other proposals, maybe as Councillor Perry has highlighted, thinking about how do we better utilise the asset of the Carriage Museum. But I think the driving or the trigger for this particular investigation was the Archbishop's Palace becoming potentially available, and then thinking about how is that an opportunity for NBC. So it's not saying the Carriage Museum isn't going to be a focus or shouldn't be a focus. It's about saying, do you know what though? If we're not interested in Archbishop's Palace because the viability is not there for us, then that probably means we go down a different route for the Carriage Museum. So my understanding was that's what that project, how that project was progressing. And maybe if members haven't, I think that's right, isn't it, Mr Green? So maybe if we haven't captured that, because I think members are broadly happy with that when we've discussed it before, that that's the way we have to progress. Because there's no point kind of going off and doing a separate proposal for the Carriage Museum if we're not going to look at Archbishop's Palace. So maybe if we haven't quite captured that, maybe we just need to look at the wording. But I was quite happy with that, and I from that briefing, I thought this captured that intent. But maybe because you've done a great job of summarising it, we've just not quite got that nuance or that background.
Thank you very much. Mr Green, do you want to say anything to that?
No, I think, Councillor Bryce, you've got it exactly right. I mean, because we own the Archbishop's Palace, we have to do something with it, and I don't think anybody would want it to just lie vacant. So that's the priority. And I would say to all members that this is at a very early stage, so we're absolutely keeping an open mind about what the opportunities are, and would welcome any ideas, any thoughts as to what we do with the Archbishop's Palace or the surrounding area.
Thank you very much. Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you, Chairman. I have no wish to talk about any particular item relating to this agenda item. My understanding was this was just a brief update to let us know the progress that had been made, rather than discussing the ins and outs of each project. So therefore, I'd like to propose the recommendations on the recommendation on page 25, which is to note the contents of the report.
Thank you very much. I'll second that from the chair, seeing as I was poised to do that after she'd finished speaking. So thank you very much. Are we all noted? Thank you very much. I just will say, though, that I took the opportunity to go round backstage, if you like, over the whole of the building, even up into the attic rooms and up round there. It is a smaller version of our museum, if I say that it is on many levels and many angles of floor, and it will present more of a problem than just keep it like it is. So I do think this bit of work needs to be doing, and I think it, once we get the report, I think it may even be worth us as a committee having a look at it, possibly. So outing. Okay, so thank you very much. Moving on to item 14 then, nominations to outside bodies. Ryan O'Connell presenting.
Good evening, members. This is a standard nominations to outside bodies report that I hope you're all fairly used to at this point. The nominations relate to the One Maidstone Bid Advisory Board, where you'll recall that at a previous meeting we were requested to ask for an additional place on the board, which was granted, so there's now one vacancy on that board. And with the additional nomination that we received, we now have 2 nominees for that one vacancy, so there will need to be a decision made by the committee on that appointment. And then for the Upper Medway Internal Drainage Board, there are 2 vacancies and 2 nominations. So those are before members to decide whether or not they want to appoint and who they want to appoint. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 2 for each post? Or is it just Councillor Round for the Medway Drainage Board?
So there's, Councillor Harper and Councillor Round for the two positions. So that's 1 for each position on the Upper Medway Drainage Board. Do you want to deal with that one first?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we approve those 2 positions. Agreed.
And then we have Councillor Joy and Councillor Garton for the 1 position that is vacant on the One Maidstone Bid Advisory Board. And there are 2 nominations. There's a nomination paper for each received by the committee. So on the basis of those nomination papers, we can take forward a vote, or you can have a discussion first.
Does anybody have anything to say? Councillor Gooch and Councillor Blackmore, in that order, please.
Thank you, Chairman. This did come late to us, didn't it, this nomination? But I have to say, I'm finding it quite difficult to decide. And the reason is this. I know that Councillor Joy is a very dedicated lady. She knows her patch, and we need to give an awful lot of weight to her application. She is the local member. She knows her patch. However, just consider what I'm battling a bit with is that we often bang on about the importance of Maidstone Town Centre, the success of Maidstone Town Centre, because of the ripples across the rest of the borough. If we have a town centre to be proud of, that just reflects on all our wonderful villages and the countryside and everything else that's wonderful about our borough. Yes, I am prejudiced in favour of our wonderful borough. But you see the point I'm making. So the point about who contributes to the town centre and its well-being is actually more of a strategic view, because if by keeping 2 local members, we're almost closing down our influence. I could be wrong here. I'm just putting this out there because this is what I'm battling with at the moment, because until I'd received Councillor Garton's application, I was more than happy to consider Councillor Joy because of her excellent credentials. She serves on other boards within her patch. Excellent job. I do think that in addition to that, bearing in mind this council has no overall control, it therefore, along the same argument, would make sense to have a ward member who represents the second big, it is the biggest party in the council, and another ward member that represents the second biggest. You've got your 2 biggest parties represented. And those are the things that I'm battling with. And the third point that occurred to me was that, in a way, you'll have an insider that is to say the existing councillor, which I thank you, Clive, which is Councillor English, coupled with the greatest of respect, I was going to call you an outsider, in the sense that geographically you are. You could bring that being a constructive friend element to the town centre. So those are the things I'm battling with, and I'd be very interested to hear what other members think. Thank you.
Councillor Blackmore, then Councillor English.
Thank you, Chairman. Most of what Councillor Gooch has said I actually agree with. However, I do have a few bits I'd like to add. Is there any reason why we only have two representatives for this organisation, bearing in mind how significant it is? Surely the broader we can make it, the better it would be. So I think it is right that the two of the High Street Ward councillors are there, but actually the greater depth of experience you have for anything, it is amazing when you have a brainstorming session who comes up with what. It's not necessarily the cleverest person there, but just someone who is bouncing off other people. So I think there is great merit in Councillor Garton's application. The other thing to bear in mind is we're looking at something that covers the town, and often what happens in the rural area can have an influence on the town. Just as Councillor Gooch has said, you get the ripples going out. Often you can get the ripples going inwards. So I think to have that crossover of ideas, like Councillor Gooch, I would have said initially, Councillor Mrs Joy, great nomination, but actually I think she already does so many other things for the centre of the town that to have a fresh face can't be such a bad thing.
Thank you. I've now got Councillor English, Councillor Perry and Councillor Bryce in that order, please.
I don't want to belabor this, but I think there might be some slight misunderstanding of quite what we're talking about, just to a certain extent. The reason there was only originally one place and now been extended to two was because a bid is primarily, unlike historic town centre managements, business-led. So in the past, the Borough Council was essentially in a partnership arrangement and was represented quite heavily on the actual strategic board, which is a separate body from this advisory board. And essentially the advisory board is more of a stakeholder forum than it is a strategic board, which is primarily businesses. And because we're in the town centre area, it's been quite difficult to find a wider range of stakeholders that were not just businesses, and we've been trying to do that because there is no parish council and a shortage of residents' associations in the actual town centre. So the argument for having myself originally and Councillor whoever tonight was actually more about representing the community in the town centre, which would otherwise not have been represented, than it was about strategic responsibility for organisations as a whole. That may or may not change how people feel about it, but I think we do need to understand that this is not the strategic management board of the bid, but is a stakeholder forum advising the board of bid. So that may or may not change anyone's votes, but I think we do need to be clear what we're talking about and why the Borough Council is a relatively small part of that representation.
Thank you for shedding some light on that. Councillor Perry.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, I understand where Councillor English is coming from. I don't really totally buy it, I have to admit, so, and I'm not convinced. I agree with what Councillor Gooch has said, and Councillor Blackmore as well. I won't repeat anything, but Councillor Garton would be a very good candidate, I think. He does bring an outside, maybe an outside view, and I think that's a good thing, because when people talk about the town, they do. It is the borough, and I'm as well, and there is an influence and a cross-fertilisation between the two, and I think that's very important, and also Councillor Garton does have a business background as well, which I think does help. So, without more ado, I would like to propose Councillor Garton for this position. Thank you. Well, I was going to, so...
Yeah, because I think we're just going to have a vote on the two things. So, thank you very much. Councillor Bryce.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor English, for giving your perspective on it. I know about Maidstone bid through, obviously, hearing them gain money for marketing campaigns for Maidstone and leading on that. So, and when you look at their website, because I think they may have started off as that, but I certainly think they've been really successful. And actually, when you look at their website, they talk about funding initiatives to tackle crime and antisocial behaviour, delivering events and promotions to increase trade and footfall in the town, and other things as well, street ambassadors. So I think maybe they're victims of their own success or happy. You'll find a better phrase than me, Councillor Gooch, this is your speciality. So I think it has broadened out. And what I would say, having a very happy working relationship with my fellow ward councillor, as I know you do with your fellow ward councillors, is that actually you work so closely as a team that I would feel quite reassured that the fantastic spirit of Councillor Joy, and I'm a big fan as well, will be channeled through you. And actually this allows another member of the council with maybe a slightly different remit and a different view to actually have a seat at the table, because I know how closely you work, and therefore you'll be able to funnel that view. And if it was a different dynamic, then I think we'd be feeling maybe differently about it. But I think we're all huge stakeholders in the town, actually. Our taxpayers out in the villages are huge stakeholders in the town. And I think, therefore, you know, when I go knocking on doors, the amount of comments I get about what the pavement looks like in the high street are phenomenal. So I think it would be really nice for us to have a voice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Does anybody else wish to speak to this? Councillor Mortimer.
Thank you. I mean, I've worked with Councillor Joy on the street scene group. We meet every couple of months, and I've seen her input, and I've spoken to officers outside of the street scene group, and she's an extremely valuable person. So if I look at this from a job application point of view, she is highly qualified, experienced, and with the greatest respect to Councillor Garton, I think she ought to get the job. Thank you.
Oh, Councillor Pearl.
When this vacancy came up, I did consider applying myself. I think Councillor Gooch sums it up very well when she talks about the things rippling out from the town centre, and obviously that happens quite literally when the police chase them over the bridge and into my street. I did, however, take the view that I thought, as has been suggested, a different perspective was actually more appropriate, somebody who wasn't sort of on top of the town and could approach it with fresh eyes. And I believe that's why Councillor Garton has applied, and that's why I'll be voting for Councillor Garton.
Okay, so it's just down to a single vote then, if everybody has now said their piece. So, could I have the votes for Councillor Denise Joy for the nominated body on the one Maidstone bid? And Councillor Patrick Garton? And abstaining? Thank you very much. Councillor Garton, you are now on the outside body for one Maidstone.
Thank you, members.
So there was an outstanding speech as your first move. That was brilliant. That's right. Right. Councillor Blackmore, did you wish to have any time now with the Part 2 papers?
No, that's okay, Chairman. If there is a spare copy, I'd be grateful to have a look at them. But to be honest, I'm sure Mr. Cornell, will be briefing us anyway. So don't worry, no need to adjourn or anything like that. I'm quite happy.
Okay, Councillor Bryce, are you in a similar situation? In which case, let's take 5 minutes for a comfort break, and if you don't have to do that and you can read, then that would be lovely. 5 minutes though, please. back here by 7:47. Thank you. Okay, would you please take your seats as I have to turn over to part 2. So if you could take your seats and places, please. Reminding you that we'll be pushing the microphones away and closing the doors. Okay, I so move that the public be excluded for the items set out in part 2 of the agenda because of the likely disclosure of exempt information for the reasons specified, having applied the public interest test. So, for those of you watching on the webcast, we will now be shutting the meeting down as far as the webcast goes, because this is the end of the meeting other than this part 2 item. So thank you very much for listening.